issues. We're going to dive into chapter 4. It's called Adventures in Asia. And I know that many of you guys are tuning in going, oh, I want to know what's going on with all of the stuff going on right now, which of course we all know is Operation Gladio. We are working diligently behind the scenes, trying to compile a whole bunch of stuff. And I will be on CanCon and Alpha Show tonight on SitRep. And we're going to basically put all of our pieces together, the three of us. So you'll not like a teaser or anything like that. If in the questions and answers, you guys have some specific things that you'd like to add or whatever, obviously we will do that in the second hour or so, depending on how long it takes us to get through chapter 4. It is a little longer chapter. We may have to break it up into 2 pieces. I don't think so. But anyway, I do encourage all of you to show up tonight at 9 on Badlands Media called SitRep, where I'll be with CanCon and Alpha and kind of run through all of the stuff that we know. So adventures in Asia. So basically, this was about choosing sides would have created a dilemma in Europe, but in the Far East, that dilemma was multiplied 1,000-fold. In China, cooperation between nationalist and communist parties broke down, talking about during the war. And soon after the defeat of Japan, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao merely resumed their struggle for leadership. And remember that there were multiple, it wasn't just these two, there were multiple warlords all kind of vying for a place in China. All over Asia, the Cold War was especially interesting in that nationalist and religious movements were recast as members of a global struggle. With China and India and Southeast Asia in the Cold War, the potential for enormous power hung in the balance. The U.S. was involved in the struggle for Asia from the beginning, because remember, we've been in the Philippines for decades by this point. There were abortive efforts to mediate between the contending factions in China, after which President Truman aligned himself with Chiang Kai-shek against the Chinese communists. Mao fielded armies nevertheless swept through the mainland China. The nationalist collapse climaxed in 1949 when the Chinese communists overran Peking and southern China, which basically is where he was hanging out. This happened despite military assistance and economic aid to Chiang. And at precisely the time when America covert action capability was coalescing within the CIA and Pentagon. The proposals were soon afoot in Washington to exploit the still contentious communist control of mainland by using a new nationalist base in the islands off the coast of China. The Korean War injected tremendous momentum into this program. In turn, this expansion eventually created a dilemma for the controllers of the secret warfare. But aside from their policy implications, as we shall see, the secret campaign against China had only minor success. More importantly, the intelligence buildup that occurred during this time because of the Korean War greatly expanded the U.S. capability and its interest in covert operations overall. After being driven from the Chinese mainland, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces succeeded in establishing themselves on multiple islands, not just Taiwan, and that's a very important point. Taiwan, or Formosa, as it was originally called, was the biggest of the islands, but they were not the only island. And the nationalists decided that they basically were going to abscond with that island and basically take it over. Hainan, Hainan, off southern China, was another island that they took over. with smaller island garrisons off the provinces of Fujian, Fukin, and Chaqing, Chekiang. There were also remnants of the nationalists on the mainland in two provinces. One was Kwangtung, which is where KMT Army comes from, and Yunnan, Yunnan. In early 1950, they were driven across the border into northern Vietnam and Burma. The coastal islands were a different matter. The Chinese communists had no navy at the time. Only small vessels, mostly what they called junks, that were available to be commandeered. Mao's army made one big effort in early 1950s to fight their way back onto Hainan, the Hainan island, which they accomplished after 10 invasions and considerable casualties. The morale in the nationalist ranks of Chiang Kai-shek basically kind of broke down, and that's the reason why they were finally able to overtake them. Superior force was no guarantee against defeat. Chiang ordered the nationalist survivors back to Taiwan. Although there were fears that the communists would follow, an invasion of Taiwan was a much more difficult proposition and was not then attempted, because at this point, the CIA is already in bed with them. So after about $2.2 billion in 1950 money, both in economic and military aid and surplus military equipment had been given to basically Chiang Kai-shek's forces. And this is where William Pauly came in. Remember, he's the guy with the Curtiss aircraft franchise, and he's getting all of the quote-unquote surplus, which isn't surplus. It's just skimming military shit and giving it to a criminal element that's going to be helping the CIA later on. So they had ships given to them, airplanes given to them, the whole Flying Tigers people are at their disposal. This is where the China lobby comes into play. Proposals for covert action actually predated nationalist defeat in the Civil War. Chiang had gone to Formosa in early 1949, resigning the presidency in favor of his vice president, General Li Teng-jen, who was left to try to negotiate a settlement with Mao. That spring, Claire Chennault, a retired American officer, Major General, who had commanded the Flying Tigers during the Japanese War, the 14th Air Force in China during World War II, organized a private airline called Civil Air Transport that operated in China. This was done for the CIA for drug running. He went to Washington with a proposal for the U.S. military to aid the nationalist bastion in southern China, plus covert aid to guerrilla forces loyal to Ling Sung-jen. The State Department was not much interested in the Chennault plan. So the former general went to his business partner in the Civil Air Transport Company called Thomas Corcoran, Corcoran. He was very well connected with the government. Corcoran put Chennault in contact with CIA officers, culminating in a series of meetings during the summer. By August, Chennault was talking to Colonel Richard Stilwell, Chief of Staff of the Far East Division of the Office of Planning, which is the organization that Frank Wisner is in charge of. He was not only interested in the military assistance, but thought an airline like Civil Air Transport could provide CIA with important covert assets. This isn't actually the way it happened, but we're going to go with it. President Truman simultaneously directed the State Department to re-examine the feasibility of Chennault's plan. just going through the back door. You get right in. Before these deliberations could be completed, however, nationalist military resistance disintegrated on the mainland. They were forcing a shift in emphasis to those operations that could be mounted from outside China. Civil air transport became even more important as a potential asset, but the airline was in financial problems. In early October, the CIA received an analysis of the Chenault Plan from George Kennan, head of the State Department's policy planning staff, which took no position on the project, but was nonetheless used by Frank Wisner as if the state had already approved it. Civil air transport was enlisted in a secret war, flying its first mission for the CIA in October 1949. Tommy Corcoran, on behalf of the Civil Air Transport, and Emmett, E-N-M-E-T, Eccles, E-C-H-O-L-S, of the CIA signed a formal agreement in November. In the Pentagon, a few days before, a detailed proposal for covert operations in China had been sent to the SecDef by a General John Magruder, Magruder. Magruder endorsed the proposal, citing his experience as chief of the Strategic Services Unit under which was a precursor to the CIA. Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson forwarded both the proposal and an accompanying memorandum from Wisner from the CIA to the president. Harry Truman expressed some interest in November, but the final collapse of the nationalists on the mainland temporarily halted the effort. The U.S. government's interest came at an opportune moment for civil air transport. Founded in 1946 by Chenault and a guy by the name of Whiting Willauer, Willauer. Civil air transport was essentially a paramilitary operation from the beginning. Yes, it was. It made its living flying troops, supplies, and dignitaries back and forth to the Chinese Civil War because the CIA wanted the opium from there. The airline's performance in 1948 was impressive. By 1949, runaway Chinese inflation and the nationalist disintegration had been rough for the civil air transport community. The CIA arrangement brought about $500,000 in hard currency. 200,000 of it was upfront. The airline was able to relocate its base over to the newly created Taiwan, and corporate headquarters set up in none other than Hong Kong, ending the chaos of existence on mainland China. Chenault's friendship with Chiang Kai-shek and his exclusive alliance with the nationalists meant the end of demand for domestic air transport once the communists had taken over. The CIA money did not resolve the underlying market problems for the private company. Civil air transport was forced to go back to the CIA again and again. And see, this is just asked backwards because it was basically a CIA company. They didn't just keep going back. Access to the fleet of transport aircraft proved to be a boon to the Office of Planning for Frank Wisner. In European air missions had to be run through the American and British Air Forces. Missions required delicate interagency discussions. Sometimes a little horse trading had to go on. In Asia, with the civilian air transport, the Frank Wisner crowd could dispense of all the politics and do whatever they wanted. Sometimes there was a question of whether the civil air transport crews would volunteer for the flights, but since Willauer's pilots flaunted their skills and their can-do attitude, that was never a problem. The earliest arms request from General Ma Pufang, a Muslim leader in northwest China. Isn't that interesting? In a Muslim leader in northwest China, who was thought to have 50,000 troops plus a trained reserve 4 times as large. Aid to the Muslims in the Northwest was the sole covert action known to have been specifically mentioned by President Truman in a November 1949 meeting on assisting anti-communist Chinese. But before shipments could be organized, General Ma was defeated. Gathering his fortune of $1.5 million in gold bars, Ma escaped on a civil air transport plane and then departed China on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Recruits willing to undertake missions to the mainland had to be found. This was not difficult because the nationalists ardently wished to return. Chiang sounded the keynote in a speech in which he promised to go back to the mainland, a theme that he dwelt on throughout the 1950s. That was a quote unquote back to the mainland. That was kind of like his rallying cry. It also became the rallying cry of a newly created entity called the China Lobby that began growing in the United States. Yet there were difficulties in Asia, not unlike those that the CIA was encountering in Europe. There were factions among nationalists, all of whom hoped to corner some prospective piece of the pie of the U.S. aid. Alfred Cox, a guy that worked for Frank Wisner, was sent to Hong Kong to represent the CIA at the headquarters of the Civil Air Transport. He found himself becoming a broker between the U.S. and the squabbling factions of the Chinese nationalists. Chinese politics embarrassed the U.S. from the earliest moments of this operation. Immediately after leaving the mainland in December 1949, 60-year-old President Lee Chong-jen went to New York for medical treatment. There, the general was invited to Washington by President Truman for an official visit. Lee claimed to have 175,000 guerrilla troops loyal to him, most of them located in southwest China. In a memorandum dated February 22nd, 1950, he proposed a 4-point program to President Truman, including the organization of guerrilla warfare, underground activities, penetration of overseas Chinese, and mobilization of liberal elements dissatisfied with both the communists and the nationalists. Now, I want to pause here for just a second because this keeps coming up. This was in the World Anti-Communist League. The Taiwanese nationalist Chinese people trying to take China back. So there's unequivocally, they're not Taiwanese. That's not even a thing. They're Chinese. They created an entire program to go to all Chinese communities in San Francisco. There were some mining communities up in the Northwest, like in Idaho, Montana, New York, any place that there was a Chinatown, they infiltrated it. Not communist Chinese, the Taiwanese Chinese. The acting president of China, Lee Sung-jen, stayed at the official Blair House residence during his visit to Washington. Now, this, of course, pisses off mainland China, who has millions of people, and Mao as the president, that this guy, Lee Sung-jen, who is temporarily president while Chiang Kai-shek's out playing war, is treated as if he is the government of mainland China, because they refer to this government as basically China's government in exile. Just keep that in mind. President Truman planned a formal reception for him as a quote unquote head of state. Not a head of state of Taiwan, the head of state of a government in China that is in exile. So, while all this is going on, if it's not crazy enough, Chiang Kai-shek decides that he is retaking the presidency and declared himself as the lawful ruler of China and reassumes the presidency. While the other guy's sitting in Washington in the middle of protocol as the president of China, kinda. So Li was instantly deprived of power and remained in the United States, where he competed with Chiang Kai shek for influence over the China Lobby Group. So, not like, and again, this is just crazy shit. So, you literally have a coup of a coup, right? So, we overthrew the actual government of Formosa and installed Chiang Kai shek. He just randomly gives this other guy the presidency and says, you take over for a little while, and comes back at a random opportunity and goes, okay, I want my crown back. And the US just immediately recognizes and tells the other guy, yeah, you can hang out over here. We're going back to our buddy Chiang Kai shek. You just can't make this shit up. So, despite all of the political struggles among the nationalists, some intelligence officers in Wisner's office continued to believe that Li Songjin offered a viable alternative, or what we have come to know as a third force in China that was not nationalist. Actually, they're fascist, because as soon as Chiang Kai shek was installed there, he declares martial law and takes over as a dictator. So here we have the third way popping up again. We've got communists over here, we've got fascist over here, and we're going to suggest a third way. But because Chiang Kai shek controlled all of the other offshore islands that became secret base options, the CIA and the US government decided they were sticking with their buddy Chiang Kai shek because he had the goods. All right, so the chief of the division within the CIA was an officer on detached service from the Army. He had actually been part of, and see, that's why I don't buy this whole, these people are like in the Army, because while he was supposed to be in the Army, he wasn't in the CIC detachment in Europe. He was in the OSS, being, the precursor to the CIA. And so then after World War II, he's in the CIA again, but he's wearing an Army uniform. That's why this stuff is bullshit. Desmond Fitzgerald was another former officer who had been in Burma and an advisor to the Nationalist Army. As early as May 1949, the Director of Central Intelligence, Rear Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, Hillencoetter, had asked the Pentagon to form a staff of service representatives to help the CIA establish their paramilitary training program. 2 months later, the Secretary of the Army approved the assistance to Frank Wisner's office in guerrilla warfare. They had space that they set up a training CIA facility where? Fort Benning, Georgia. Yeah, set it up. The Pentagon went on to establish a staff to coordinate military arrangements for psychological warfare, which of course we know is done at Fort Bragg, and covert operations with CIA in November. So now this is very early on, and this has been consistently the case throughout all of this time. Despite the military cooperation, the Frank Wisner's Far East Division chief refused to commit the CIA to any command arrangement with the Pentagon. Richard Stilwell would only say that he was reasonably certain that military theater commanders would be informed of and could approve covert actions carried out in their areas. That was bullshit. They were never informed, and the CIA could have cared less because they set up military all the time conducting these operations without their knowing it. Having kept its options open, the CIA began to put in place elements necessary for a secret war against China. an office under the commercial cover of Western Enterprises. So, Bridget, if you were SR-71, could find that one. That was the name of like a Edwin Wilson type front company. It was called Western Enterprises, was opened in Taiwan in 1950. It was called Western Auto, which of course used to be a used car part place, by agents. Training and operational bases followed in Taiwan, as well as many offshore islands. After promises of action against the mainland from the beginning of 1950, a small raid occurred near Nanhui, Nanhwei, in April, and a larger one near Shihpu, Shihpu, sorry. The port of Canton was momentarily cut off from the interior by actions of a force that was 30,000 guerrillas, was brought ashore in China to conduct military operations. So the CIA is attacking China. Deep inside China, in a province called Sinkiang, Sinkiang, American money was reportedly funneled into tribal minorities and some white Russians who formed a cavalry unit to resist the communists. This is the setting up of Operation Gladio inside of China. These are small units. And remember, this is a tactic of the West. This is what they did in all of Africa. They went to small, oppressed tribal entities, trained them to be assassins, and then turned them loose. And if they could actually get control of the province, like they did in Africa, they put these minorities in charge of the majority with a small contingent of like French or Belgium military. And then they just open slaughtered them. And as long as they were killing each other, they were free to steal all the resources and they didn't really care. So you see the exact same thing going on here. Peking radio broadcast several times charged D.C. McKiernan, and I'm going to spell that for you, Mackiernan, the American vice consul in the area, with providing aid to these small stay-behind units. Before the end of the year, Taiwan leaders had claimed to have more than 1 million active guerrillas throughout mainland China. The U.S. intelligence estimated that the number was more around 650,000. The Chinese communists openly admitted the existence of this resistant force and conducted bandit suppression operations against the guerrillas. Reporting to a party congress in June of 1950, Mao mentioned a figure of 400,000 bandits, an estimate that was their estimate of it. Shortly before, Peking claimed the arrest of an astonishing 20,000 agents of U.S. military intelligence since the beginning of 1949. During the course of the 1950, the People's Liberation Army mobilized more than 1.2 million men in Central and South China in an effort to kick the bandits out of mainland China. That November, there were even reports that there had been shifts in troops from the province that was just across the channel of Taiwan to another area to counter this guerrilla activity. Much of the initial guerrilla threat had had more to do with the kind of basically like Civil War infighting. In many places in China, there were nationalist remnants, local warlords, and bandits. The fact that the guerrillas didn't hinder Peking from withdrawing from southern China the field armies that it had used to intervene in the Korean War. Thus, the military impact of the um, anti communist guerrillas, this guy said was minimum. But you don't have mobilized almost 1.2 million people to fight this element without it being significant. And you also don't have, and think about that. Today, you have what, 20 million illegal aliens in the United States? And depending on which number you want to use here, 1,600,000, whatever, of trained guerrillas in a country attacking the country and its leadership. And that's why, if you go back, and believe me, I know how this is going to sound, but I want you guys to put your thinking caps on because this requires critical thinking. What part of the famines, because we know that this entire group that's doing this have no problems in Chile and Nicaragua. Remember, they mined the harbor. They established the blockade around Chile so that they were basically starving the people. So it makes you wonder when you go back, and I don't know that we'll ever know this, but it does make you wonder what part of the famines, both in the Soviet Union and in China, was a result of this. I don't know the answer to that. And what amount of the deaths that we were told was from the Soviet Union killing its own people, and the same thing with the communist Mao forces, had to do with this. Was there an effort, and this is an honest question, was there an effort to make these people kill their own people by us propping up these guerrilla forces in order to then demonize communism even more? Not that it's not awful, but we need a, like a 20,000-pound gorilla if we're going to go install a bunch of dictators all over the world. We have to make installing dictators look good compared to how bad communism is. Because if communism wasn't really, really bad, then I wouldn't be able to use it as the boogeyman, right? It's the whole thing with radical Islam. If I don't create vicious, head chopping off assholes to demonize the Muslim religion, well, I can't use it as the boogeyman. So I've got to be extra gross in order to make the less gross fascism appear the better way than the much worse gross communism or Islamic radicalism, right? You see what I'm saying? This is a vicious circle that these people literally did. None of this is figurative. This all happened. So it's really crazy when you start thinking about it that you would insert 1,600,000, whatever number you want to use, into China to create basically stay behind units to destabilize that country and kill millions and millions of people. And then from the outside, because all of the information of what's really going on the inside is hidden from us, they tell us that it's just Mao going crazy. He's a psycho. He's a communist. He's just killing all of his own people. While they know they're instigating it. They're putting people in to train them to do it, to attack their fellow Chinese. So it's just some days when you read about this stuff, it's just mind-boggling when you look at the totality of it. And so that's why for you and I, who look at modern day operations like plowing over, people in a crowd, that's nothing to these people. These are generation after generation of these people growing up with this demonic method of trying to instigate this one world totalitarian um, regime. And they will go to any length to do it. And I think it's important to understand that if you don't stop them, this is where you end up. The new phase of the secret war began with the outbreak of hostilities in Korea in 1950. The end of World War II had left Korea, like Germany, divided into occupation zones, making reunification a political issue. The Soviets in the North and the Americans in the South each proceeded to organize governments in their area. Now, this is not true. What the Soviets and what the Americans were supposed to be doing is getting the Japanese out. They weren't setting up separate governments. Unlike Germany, in Korea, the occupation forces of the superpowers were, and according to this guy says, they were withdrawn, leaving the Koreans to settle their own quarrels. That is blatantly false. The US government never left. We have documented proof, which is in our other exposures when we covered Korea. This is a bold-faced lie. Sharpening rhetoric and hyperbole threats from the North and the South to achieve reunification by force ended in a North invasion of the South. Again, not true. What we did, because we never left, was we created stay-behind units in the South and sent them into the North. And those stay-behind units were the ones that were attacking internally into the North. And why did we do that? Because they knew that the South was farmland. The North was the industrial, just kind of like us. During the Civil War, you had the North where all the industry was, all the well-off people, the educated people, and then you had farmers in the South. Not that they weren't educated, but it was much more rural. And that was the same case with Korea. And what happened is that Kim, who stayed throughout the entire war and fought on behalf of Koreans who had been occupied for 35 years by Japan, was a folk hero. And he could not be controlled. And they had assigned OSS agents with him. They knew he could not be controlled and that he was not going to allow the US to occupy Korea. Wasn't going to happen under him. So they pick a guy over in, I believe he was in Shanghai. That's where he hung out the war. He wasn't even in Korea at the time. And so no one in the South liked him. They hated him because he left. They felt like he was like he betrayed his fellow Koreans. And he was actually even educated in Japan. I mean, he was like the worst of the worst. And so the US forces basically annihilate all of the nationalists, like we end up doing in the Phoenix program. All of the nationalists that wanted a unified Korea that was located in the South, in the area that we occupied, we just killed them. Massive amounts of people, entire cities. And we studied all of that. And so in doing all of that, we insert these agitators into the North, and basically the North attacking them was claimed as attacking the South, but they were doing it in the North area. So, and then remember, Reverend Moon was in prison in the North. And as MacArthur's troops move up across into the area that had been the former being oversaw by the Soviet Union, that according to this guy was gone, but they weren't. Reverend Moon had been arrested and imprisoned for sexual perversion. Whatever that meant, I don't know. But there were articles about him having sex He was basically a pedophile. And he was freed by MacArthur and goes on to set up the Unification Church. So, yay. Um, okay. So, within days, Truman decided to oppose the North's invasion, committing the U.S. to the war. And I want you to think about this. So we're post World War II, and they've been occupied as a country for 35 years by Japan. There would obviously be some internal um, feuding going on. And if that's the case, that would be a civil war and none of our damn business. Our business should have been isolated to getting the Japanese out and leaving. We didn't leave. The U.S. sought and obtained a UN mandate. But what was that UN mandate? Y'all remember? Like a handful of people from the UK and a couple Australians. It was not a UN mandate, and nor was it a UN force, even though that's the way American history is taught. That was bullshit. The Korean hostilities created a demand for covert operations against the North. The China programs, if anything, were reinvigorated, especially after November 1950, when the U.S. forces had actually crossed into China. Because remember, and this is the crazy part about this, the more you read, we're all over China. Supposedly, China got involved, but we're all over China. The CIA is all over China with these covert operations. We're literally in China before the Korean War ever even starts. Did anybody learn that in history? No. Supposedly, they just decided to join in because they're all one big communist happy family. That's not how that worked at all. The U.S. went across the Chinese border again, just north of Korea. And that's what prompted China to come in and help North Korea. So this stuff is just crazy. All right. So now you've got the CIA's main strength as assigned to clandestine intelligence missions by the higher ups. We're working out of a place called Yokosuka. And Frank Wisner's group, by contrast, was, according to this guy, just getting into action. They've been there. They're crazy. The OSS was there. They never left. The new station chief for Wisner arrived in Tokyo to discover that his total strength consisted of 6 men living out of hotel rooms. One impediment to a rapid expansion of Frank Wisner's area was General MacArthur. Because at this time, he's now running all over the theater. And he doesn't ever actually go to Korea like to be a ground force commander. He tries to do the whole thing out of, it's not that he doesn't go there, but he tries to run the whole thing out of Japan. So it was a cluster. And keep in mind, he was not all that hot on having OSS in his area of operation, but they were all over. So any conversation, like we know Paul Helliwell was hanging around with Chiang Kai-shek during World War II. So they will try to tell you that General MacArthur kept all of the OSS agents out of his AOR, which supposedly was all of Pacific Theater, which is like all of the Pacific Theater. That's absolutely not true. You had Lansdale, you had Helliwell, you had all of those guys all over the Pacific Theater. So they were definitely there. So the Far East Command could not refuse the CIA access to Korea, but MacArthur definitely was not all that happy with them being there, um, according to this author. And I've read that in other books as well, but mainly from the reason that MacArthur was a control freak. MacArthur also continued to entrust special operations to the staff officer with whom he had personal ties that he used as his director of intelligence, which was Willoughby. Initially, the military had by far the greatest resources for paramilitary operations. The Air Force transport stood ready at several bases in Japan. The Navy sent out from San Diego the fast transport Horace Bass, a ship equipped with 4 landing craft and modified to carry 162 commandos, submarine reconnaissance troops, and Navy underwater demolition teams would join what became the Special Operations Group. Only 2 days later, from August 1950, the capability was augmented with an additional submarine unit called the Perch, converted to carry up to 160 troops. The British also contributed a squad. A squad. You see what I mean? This was not UN. This was a joke. Of Royal Marines. The CIA had the Civil Air Transport to use as its air transportation. The new commander for Wisner was a guy by the name of Hans H.A.N.S. Tofte, T-O-F-T-E. He was the son of a sea captain. He spoke fluent Chinese and had worked for 10 years in a shipping company in Peking and Manchuria before the war. Another of the band of OSS veterans, Tofte was part of the OSS. His World War II experience had been in organizing arm shipments to guerrillas across the Adriatic Sea from Bari, Italy, which would have been Albania. Isn't that interesting? He later parachuted into France, and he also managed as many as 44 vessels. A Danish citizen by birth, Tofte returned to Copenhagen after the war as a local manager for who? Pan Am Airlines. You can't make this up. Too bad war hamsters watching football right now. Later, he married an American woman and moved to Iowa, where he remained active in the Army Reserves. When the Frank Wisner unit began its China operations, they sought him out, and Richard Stilwell basically was his recruiter. He definitely wanted him back on the team. Deputy Desmond Fitzgerald, who was Stilwell's deputy, and Stilwell met with him to try to get him back in. The 43-year-old Tofte was on summer active duty with his reserve unit when he learned about what was going on in Korea. 2 days later, he showed up at the CIA Washington, D.C. headquarters. Frank Wisner saw in him a well-qualified former comrade who could speak 6 languages, including Chinese. Hans was hired on the spot and sent to Japan. Tofte quickly began creating the infrastructure for CIA operations. At the base called Atsugi, A-T-S-U-G-I, he and his deputy, Colwell Beers, B-E-E-R-S, found a 50-track acre isolated piece of land at the corner of this base and set up shop. They had construction battalions, they had engineers, blah, blah, blah. And they basically ended up with a facility to accommodate 1,000 people. So they were going to use it to train Koreans for behind the line missions. That sounds like Gladio. Topke recruited an energetic Marine officer by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Dutch Kramer, Kraemer, to run the base. The Military Special Operations Group coordinated sea transport for agents, while the Civil Air Transport ferried all of the equipment around. One early result of Wisner's Korean War expansion was Operation Bluebell, an attempt to gather intelligence on North Korea and Chinese troop movements. Literally thousands of Korean refugees were dispatched behind enemy lines and told to make up their way as far as they could. Returning refugees were then debriefed on what they had learned. The quality of information from Bluebell is demonstrated by the CIA's conclusion that children would be their best source of intelligence. Another project was a movie that began in the late 1950s based on the diary kept of a Japanese colonel imprisoned after the war in a Siberian labor camp. Imagine that. Hollywood getting in on the act. I would like to say I'm shocked. The film opened in 20 Japanese theaters and played over 700 times. When the Wisner officers added up the figure, they had produced a profit of $100,000. A paramilitary operation, STOLE, S-T-O-L-E, was a covert attempt to block Indian medical aid from being given to Mao's Chinese as a humanitarian mission. So isn't that weird that India wants to provide humanitarian aid to China, mainland China, and they want to mount a paramilitary operation to stop that. Medical supplies, including makings for 3 full field hospitals, were aboard a Norwegian freighter en route to China. Operation Stole was to stop the shipment at all costs. CIA approved $1 million for this effort. Hans Tofte met in Tokyo with other station chiefs to plan the operation. At one point, Cox in Hong Kong made preparation for sabotage under the noses of the British authorities. In the case of the Norwegian ship docked there, where the British people were actually on that ship. When the freighter bypassed Hong Kong, a more discreet plan evolved. Topke simply approached Chiang Kai-shek, who was happy to lend his patrol boats to a scheme for stopping the ship on the high seas, like pirates, kind of like they taught the Somali pirates to do. Cox and other CIA agents were present, though hidden below deck, with nationalist gunboats pirated the cargo. So you've got CIA agents hanging out while the pirates are attacking a fellow NATO entity. The general expansion of covert operations naturally exacerbated the command problems. In Tokyo, the Far East Command set up a command liaison group under an intelligence staff to supervise all of the goings-on. The CIA officer controlled the area called Documents Research Division, which planned operations. The Joint Advisory Commission in Korea, called JAC, Joint Advisory Commission Korea, actually ran the activity. Its head, a military officer, detailed to the CIA. In additional management organization, Covert, Clandestine, and Related Activities Korea, or CCRAC, was formed in December of 51, and further in a further unsuccessful effort to eliminate duplication, and organize the CIA paramilitary efforts. Decisions in Washington sharpened the command problems by expanding the scope of the covert operations. In the first week of the war, President Truman gave orders to protect Taiwan with naval patrols by the 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Straits. By late 1951, he was asking what additional actions needed to be taken to hurt the Chinese communists. In early 1951, National Security Council Policy NSC 101 approved support for a quote unquote vigorous program of covert operations to aid the guerrillas. Disruption of Chinese supply lines was explicit in NSC 118. And President Truman approved this by the end of the year. In early 1952, the Joint Chiefs issued orders for the Navy to provide the CIA with ships and facilities for coastal landings on mainland China and Korea. Joint planners at the Pentagon, in deference to their loyalties to Lee Sung-jin, and others were arguing that the U.S. should support all of the anti-communists, not just Chiang Kai-shek. The Joint Strategic Planning Committee recommended $300 million to conduct covert operations all over mainland China. The CIA's association with Chiang Kai-shek's faction, the paramilitary planners, warned covert activity within China would be unlikely to overthrow the Chinese regime in the absence of an all-out counter-revolutionary movement. But that didn't stop them. In the summer of 1952, when it merged the OPC and OSO, the two branches of the CIA doing this, into a single directorate of plans, the CIA established a North Asian command to consolidate control over previous operations against the Chinese ran from Japan, the offshore islands, and Thailand. But then Wisner had created an international network, including shipments in elements in Singapore and Burma, to include Japan and Korea. Also, the Pacific islands of Saipan. All of these entities were serviced by the CIA airline Civil Air Transport. The CIA facilities primarily existed to support paramilitary operations. Koreans were mainly recruited in that country, and Japanese were trained on an island called Yeongdo Island, YONG-DO. Chinese were recruited wherever possible, but mostly from the island of Taiwan, where they would also receive training. Advanced training for recruits for both the nationalists were all provided by the CIA at a secret base in the middle of the Pacific on Saipan. Actually, by using the island, the U.S. violated every aspect of international law, since Saipan was technically a UN dependency, part of a trust territory in the Pacific that was mandated to maintain neutrality. When supervision of the trust was transferred from military to civilian hands in 51 and 52, the Navy successfully fought a Department of Interior plan to place the trust territory headquarters on Saipan because it would interfere with security, national security. The CIA facility used a military designation called Naval Technical Training Unit. Naval Technical Training Unit was a CIA unit. Nothing to do with the Navy at all. Recruits were flown in at night on C-47s from the Civil Air Transport. They were blindfolded to be taken from the airport to the facility, but the facility was like on a mountain, so you could see everything. And it was like, what the hell did you blindfold me for when I'm going to run around this base being trained and I can see the whole freaking island? It was stupid. But I've not found the CIA all that impressive when it comes to not being stupid. After training, the recruits were returned to the hands of the operators to conduct their missions. These missions included commando raids, sabotage strikes on selected targets. In Korea, intelligence was gathered by patrols who landed on both coasts in China. They organized quote unquote anti-communist resistant units, which we know to be Operation Gladio. Over 1,200 Koreans were trained eventually at Yeongdo to form strike teams to conduct these special missions. Under several covers designated that finally ended the Far East Command Liaison Detachment in Korea, they established the 8240 Army Unit for the Far East Command, and they ran the paramilitary program. So you have C-46s, C-47s, and you have the units they labeled Leopard, Kirtland, and Wolfpack. Wolfpack was set up in 52 that had 4,000 Koreans, 7 Americans that were basically the command staff and some comm people. And they operated off of an island of Korea. And I bet I know what island that is. Raids frequently involved naval gunfire support and bombing. Wolfpack had grown to 8 battalions with over almost 7,000 men and 12 Americans shortly after it was set up. Early 1953, Far East Command took cadres from Wolfpack and basically, used them in an organization called the UN Partition Forces of Korea, which, I'm not even going to say that. The CIA operations against the mainland were generally smaller, but more widespread. Advance as far as smaller in numbers of people. Advice, training, and supplies were given to Chiang Kai-shek's forces, who claimed in 1952 to have made 15 raids on the mainland in 7 months. The strength of the CIA station on Taiwan already exceeded 600 CIA agents. Airdrops of propaganda leaflets, and they had, in just a few months, they dumped 300 million leaflets, all of which were flown by the Civil Air Transport and the Nationalist Air Force, which of course we know was supplied by William Pauly. The second program of aid to the guerrillas in northern China were not loyal to Chiang, but was carried out by the CIA. This operation, known as Tropic, to the Civil Air Transport pilots, used the crews flying out of Japan at night in unmarked C-47s. Yale class of 51 was heavily recruited for the program, recalls John Downey, D-O-W-N-E-Y, who joined the CIA that year after graduation, assigned to set up resistance in Kirin, K-I-R-I-N. Downey visited Saipai in 1952 to select a 4-man team who were going to be dropped in July. In November, Downey and Richard Fecteau, F-E-C-T-E-A-U, who had been in the CIA only 5 months and was a part of the Civil Air Transport flight crew, was forced down in China when attempting to recover an agent parachuted into Kirin to observe the team at work. The failure of this November 29th flight and capture of Downey and Fecteau by the Chinese communists mentally brought a halt to the entire northern Chinese program. The 22-year-old Downey remained imprisoned in China until 1973, 20 years. And I have a book that I just got. Um, yes, I know, Bridget, another book. Um, but this book is crazy. It's actually his story. Where is the book? Because it tells the story. Yeah, right here. It's called Agents of Subversion: The Fate of John T. Downey and the CIA's Covert War in China. We're going to read this book, but what they just, and I just want to tell you this because how this guy that's writing this book, although overall it's a good book, I have to point out the fallacies of it. When he says that the aircraft was forced down, I want you to understand what they were trying to do. They had basically, because they couldn't find a place to land, because I've already started reading that other book. They had like a drop, literally like a hook, like a fishing pole set up on the back of an aircraft that they were flying real low to hook this guy and snatch him out of there. That was their plan. What a bunch of freaking morons. And first of all, it would have killed the guy if they would have ever jerked him. I mean, this is just so stupid. But it was a trap. The Chinese were all around them when they tried it. And that's how they were able, because you're talking about, back in 1950, whatever, 52, 53, they didn't have a lot of anti-aircraft anything. They literally were like shooting with guns, and forced the aircraft, disabled basically the aircraft, and these guys survived the crash landing, but were captured. And yeah, Downing stayed a prisoner for 20 years. Okay, one of the biggest CIA operations in China was known, codenamed Paper, Paper. It began in February 51. Operation Paper was nothing less than an invasion of China by nationalist guerrillas based in Shan states of northern Burma, which is where we set up Chiang Kai-shek's army. This paramilitary effort was carried out in the face of the Burmese government and created an unnecessary international controversy. It also led to an organized nationalist Chinese involvement in heroin traffic that continues today. But that's not what created it. Come on, we know. Chiang Kai-shek was supplying 7/8 of the entire world heroin. This issue didn't start it. The Indians selling opium to the nationalists in China started it, long before the Korean War ever started. Project Paper began with Li Mi, L-E, last name M-I, or excuse me, L-I-M-I, another of Chiang Kai-shek's generals. He was an army commander. He had been an army commander in central China. Li had not been above executing some of his subordinates that he didn't think minded him well enough. Very ruthless. Li escaped in disguise when his army disintegrated in his campaign against Mao. He made his way to the Yunnan province, where he was placed in command of the nationalist KMT army. When the provincial governor left the KMT area in December 1949, virtually handing over the administration to the communists, Li Mi called out his troops and took over the city. During the early months of 1950, he slowly retreated towards the Chinese border as the Mao forces were entering the Yunnan province. About 1,500 of Li Mi's troops withdrew into Indochina, where the French interned them after disarming them. And that's, of course, Vietnam. But the French had an army in Vietnam, while Burma had little in the way of military force in their northern area. So They had also had a revolt of a group in Burma called the Karens. Not making it up. Keren. An entire tribe of Karens. In all of the
that is just so freaking funny.
It is.
Sorry.
Whole group of Karens. In these conditions, General Limi was easily able to cross the Burmese border with an organized force of several thousand from the nationalist area. Once in the country, the Chinese drafted these disgruntled tribespeople into their service. And that's how they ended up occupying Burma for a while as they're getting pushed out of China. Project Paper was intended to reinforce and re-equip Li Mi's band for a reinsertion into China. It was made possible by the CIA's Civil Air Transport, which could parachute instructors and weapons into the Chinese occupied, the Chiang Kai-shek occupied area of Burma. Airplanes flew missions that had been set up in Bangkok, Thailand, with personnel shuttled down from Taiwan and other areas such as Okinawa. So we're occupying the entire damn Asian theater at this point. The whole operation was coordinated by a man called Alfred Cox, C-O-X, who was the chief of station in Hong Kong, and Sherman Joost, Joost, who was chief of station in Bangkok. Cover for the Li Mi arm flow was ingeniously provided through a parallel operation carried out by the Thai government to train and equip paramilitary forces for their country. So they're pretending to equip Thailand while they are in fact equipping the Chiang Kai-shek forces to reattack China. Very clever. In Miami, the CIA chartered a company called the Overseas Southeast Asia Supply Company, C Supply. And we know all about that because that's Paul Helliwell. We've come across this one multiple times. They had a $38 million government contract to supply shit to Taiwan. Taiwan? Yeah, but it all ended up in Burma. In a cable addressed, quote unquote, hatchet, gave commercial cover to CIA officers working in both Thailand and the Chinese area. By the end of 1953, there were about 200 employees at C Supply, plus another 76 Americans in the embassy working covertly as advisors. Well, they were labeled advisors, but they were covert operators for the CIA. Some 4,500 Thai soldiers had been trained and equipped to aid them in this operation. Whatever happened to Li Mi, the Thai came out with a bargain because they're going to get a crap load of money. The assistant of, and they ended up with $35 million in money because this is the same police chief that helped set up all the drug operations. The assistance of Li Mi and the existence of C Supply were open secrets in Bangkok. Sherman Joost, experienced as a team leader with the OSS in the same Burma area, loved the attention. Operation Paper began with 3 civil air transport planes picking up equipment in Okinawa, airdropping them to Li Mi's partisans, and that became a regular channel mission. The Burmese government evidently first learned about this operation when its own intelligence officers were observing the Chinese dropping their own air supplies in response to the CIA's air supplies. Meanwhile, Li Mi began calling his forces in southern China Anti-Communist National Salvation Army. The first invasion into China was accompanied by CIA officers and regular supply drops in April 1951. The nationalists advanced into the Yunnan province, but were driven right back out within a week. Li Mi sent his subordinate Lu Ku Chong on a second incursion that was also defeated almost immediately. This failure should have, and I can't even remember, this is so funny. The author says it should have triggered somebody to look at this and decide we probably shouldn't be doing that. But does that ever work with the CIA? No, because it's just dead bodies of somebody else. They don't care. So David Key, Key, the U.S. ambassador to Burma, reported from Rangoon that the Burmese government had knowledge of Americans in the area and of the U.S. equipment being provided to the nationalists. He concluded that this adventure had cost us heavily in terms of any goodwill that we may have had with the Burmese. Washington was to decide that the support for Li Mi was insufficient and wanted to ramp it up. Because, you know, if you're effing up something, you might as well just go all in on it. The new logistics support director, James Garrison, was brought in to manage the now substantial arms flow into Taiwan, Thailand, and Burma. The American engineers were sent in to supervise the reopening of a World War II airport. The Civil Air Patrol began an even larger airlift that was no longer confined to parachute drops. Some 700 nationalist troops from Taiwan reinforced Li Mi and had basically grown a force to 12,000 strong. Open controversy erupted after the Chinese communists in late December 1951 publicly charged the U.S. of an invasion and support of sending in Taiwan to Thailand and Burma. These charges were then made by the Soviet diplomats at the UN because China's not allowed at the UN, right? So they have to basically communicate through the Soviet Union to even get it, because Taiwan is sitting in the China chair at the UN. That's what makes this whole thing a joke. After several State Department denials, including one from Dean Atkinson, and a statement by the American delegation to the UN, the nationalists had simply failed to honor a pledge to remove their troops from Burma. The Burma UN delegate agreed with the charges that Li Mi was receiving outside support from the US. The nationalist denials were countered by the evidence of copies of actual orders from Chiang Kai-shek to Li Mi that had been captured by the Burmese army. In the middle of the controversy, the New York Times reported on February 11th, 1952, that witnesses in Burma had seen Li Mi's soldiers opening brand new American weapons. This was followed in April by reports that the Burmese sources that Americans, including ex-military flyers, were smuggling weapons into the nationalist Chinese in Burma. The U.S. persisted in its denials, and to lessen the visibility of the issue, Chiang Kai-shek prevailed upon Li Mi to return to Taiwan. To explain the nationalist ability to acquire arms, reports were leaked that Li Mi's men had been selling opium to finance their operations. This is almost a joke at this point. Yeah, because that was a leak. Like that wasn't exactly how they were getting the weapons to begin with. No matter how threadbare the cover story was, the Americans' denials continued. The true facts were so closely held within the CIA that the CIA analyst branch were not even told of them, nor was supposedly not most of the State Department, but a lot of the people in the State Department knew too. The U.S. ambassador to India, Chester Bowles, Bowles, asked for and received assurances, that there was no American aid going to the Li Mi or any nationalist, as Asian governments increasingly refused to accept these claims. Bowles was reduced to arguing that no American administration could afford to halt the arms to Chiang Kai shek during an election year for fear of being accused of being a communist. You see how that works? It's like magic. So, when William Sebald, Sebald, who's on his way to be the new ambassador to Burma, received similar assurances, Sebald attempted to repeat the disclaimer at a diplomatic reception. The Burmese Army Chief of Staff replied to him, "Mr. Ambassador, I have it cold. If I were you, I'd just keep quiet." Like, shut up, bitch. We know what you're doing. In the summer of 1952, Li Mi returned to Burma to lead a second invasion into China. This time, they have 2,100 nationalists that march 60 miles into the heart of China. But they were all driven right back out. This was the last of any effective invasion from Burma. And they basically have Li Mi's operation against the Chinese communists were ruled to be ineffective. It led to the ruin of the U.S. relations with Burma for most of the 1950s because, of course, we had no credibility with any of them. And there was a proposed resolution banning the nationalist Chinese presence inside of Burma. And Li Mi's operation had been dear to some of the CIA officers like Desmond Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was another member of the wartime Burma contingent. Having served there, he had been educated at private schools to include Harvard. And the 42-year-old Fitzgerald often served as a conduit for special proposals made by the CIA. He pursued a Cold War confrontation with a fervor that was just absolutely crazy, and he played an important role in stopping the initial cancellation of Operation Paper when it should have been canceled within the first couple of operations. So he's a war hawk. And here is Chester Bowles by this evaluation of the Li Mi operation was given to Chester Bowles by an Indonesian cabinet member in 1953. This is a quote. "What could be more ridiculous than to allow American arms to be used to build up the power of a renegade group totally incapable of inflicting any damage to the communist Chinese, but fully capable of thwarting the democratic Burman government effort to crush her own communist rebellion and bring order to a troubled nation." And that's basically the bottom line. I mean, and we did this all over the world. 7 years later, in 1959, intelligence officers would tell the U.S. president that the Chinese nationalists in Burma caused nothing but difficulty, which is true because it destabilized Burma and basically allowed China to have a much bigger presence in Burma. So all of those people that tell you that Burma is a mess now, and of course, that it's called Myanmar now. We did it. We destabilized the entire country. We made a laughingstock of their government with their own people because the government couldn't keep us and Chiang Kai-shek out. We destroyed the country, all to launch a bunch of unsuccessful paramilitary operations. And this is all going on at the same time you're running a war next door in Korea. So that pretty much ends the chapter. But I think it's important to take a step back here and look at all of what we just uncovered. We have been attacking China through all of the post World War II timeframe up to this point. All right. So from the mid 40s to the mid 50s, we consistently was attacking China, not the other way around. You can make all the argument you want about the fact that Mao was communist and that Chiang Kai shek somehow wasn't communist. Okay, but Chiang Kai shek set up basically a dictatorship on Taiwan that was even more evil than Mao in China, because we have State Department cables from Taiwan of the ambassador looking out his window and watching Formosans being bayoneted in their stomach in the middle of the streets because they were trying to protest martial law because they had lived on an island free, other than the occupation by Japan. And they thought when the war was over and the US made the Japanese leave that they were going to be free. They were never free. We imposed Chiang Kai shek on them, and he turned around, and anybody that said anything about freedom or the Chinese people wanting to associate with their family on mainland China were murdered. And then, of course, we know Taiwan's role in the World Anti-Communist League, and it kind of snowballed from there. But it's a crazy story. Anyway, that's it for today. Do we
I still can't get over an entire tribe of Karens.
An entire tribe. There, it's spelled Keren, but yeah, right. An entire tribe of Karens.
Yep. They just tickled my funny bone at the time.
So, yeah, I wanted to look something up real quick. Is that Moneypenny? Yes.
Yes, it's your stalker. I love you to death. Oh my God, you are my new obsession. I come from a military family, and I was formerly an investigative reporter with the BBC before, obviously, they sacked me because I got too investigative and found out all their secrets. But I'm always investigating stuff, and I'm currently investigating stuff that relates to what you've been talking about, but a couple of decades later on. And I politely asked the lovely co-host, Bridget, whether or not I could politely ask a polite question after you'd finished.
Sure.
I don't want to be invasive, but do you make a decision on which of the years or decades or particular topics you go into well in advance? And could I push you into looking at a particular era and time where I've got a really pressing investigation, where I think I've broken through some very high intel type stuff that I think you might be able to help me with?
Sure. What is it?
For other people, it's not completely self-centered.
Sure. What is it?
It's about China and China, the Russian GIU, the Chinese PLA, and the United States all getting into big tears in the early 2010s through to the late 2015-16s, when a whole load of nuclear stuff was going wrong, and there were lots of things moving by cargo, by plane, by ship, and whatever, and advanced technology was coming into missiles and all that sort of stuff. I honestly think you could probably help me.
Yeah, I mean, you can DM me and let me know specifically what. And I certainly will. I think I probably know somebody that can help you a lot more than me, but I definitely will do what I can.
So the more general question, thank you for that. Thank you.
Sure.
All the stuff about China that you've been talking about today, and I wholeheartedly 100% agree with the way that you summarized it at the end. very powerful in saying that effectively, and not surprisingly, unfortunately, and I'm going to put some barbed British humour into that, the US was the aggressor and China not the crazy communist backstabbing aggressor that maybe it's been made out to be through the media and other twisted psychological impact that the media has had on the Western world. So I'm looking for more evidence of where China and the United States, or even with Russia at certain points, we're talking 1950s, Cold War type era, worked hand in hand on different things, like, for example, technology, like, for example, the World Genome Project or biosciences. Because I've just found something where China and the United States in 1951 through to 59 were working side by side on something that totally stunned me, that they would be working on something, and that is on semiconductors and chip technology. And at the time, they were literally Chinese and Americans working in the same office on that sort of stuff.
But hold on, Moneypenny, you're doing what I did. See, they're not talking about Chinese. They're talking about Taiwanese.
Ah, so that was it.
Yes. You're doing the exact same mistake I made when I first started doing this. And I went back through all of my military books. I have a ton of books that I bought when I was at Air War College. These assholes in all of the communications refer to, I just said this. When you go back and you look at the UN up until the point that we recognized China in 1972-ish, every reference to China in the UN is Taiwan. It's not China at all. China didn't exist. To the UN, Mao and mainland China did not exist.
How crazy is that? And how, completely, well, not blackmailed, obviously, but, how completely brainwashed have we been? Even those that consider ourselves, somewhat academic.
It's all a lie. I know. And that's the thing that blows me away. So you really have to dig into, that's just like here. Elaine Chao, goofball, what's his name? Cocaine Mitch, McConnell's wife. She's Taiwanese. She's not Chinese. And forever, people had said that he's married to, China and blah, 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 and, communist this and blah, blah, blah. If you look into her history, she's actually from, not that Taiwan isn't, we've already figured out that it's basically all Chinese people, but her family was a shipping magnate on Taiwan. And if you look at who set her dad up in business, you're talking about Chiang Kai-shek. You're talking about William Pauly. She is from this very group that I'm talking about.
Interesting. So on that basis, and that makes a lot of relevance, if there were historical records, I'm talking wiki cables here, not the WikiLeaks, which are normally emails, but wiki cables, which are fascinating because not many people bothers to look at them, but they are direct cable transmissions between, going all the way back to 1971, all the way through to 2010. I can read all the cables that are now no longer confidential between US presidents and world leaders right across the world globally. Something that not many people realize that is even there, but there are references to things where we even get a sort of tripartite structure, and this is about the same era, of Russia, China, in inverted commas, and the United States pulling together on certain projects. How do we read that?
Well, we have to make sure it's China, China, not China, Taiwan. That's the first thing.
I've lost.
Yeah, sorry, my daughter was trying to call me. We have to make sure that it's China, China, and not China, Taiwan. And again, you had elements in, I don't even know how to start this. This is a very deep conversation, Moneypenny. Because if you go back to the premise that, and I'd have to see the cables to be able to understand the context, but if you go back to Anthony Sutton's premise that this basically has all been, and I don't mean this the way it sounds, but it's the easiest way to describe it. This whole thing has been theater, that actually we were never at war with the Soviet Union, that behind the scenes, there was a lot of cooperation. Um, and the same is true with mainland China, which is how we ended up with the recognition in the 1970s. And that the whole reason all of this has gone on is so that the powers to be in Britain, the US, and NATO in general, I'll just use NATO, that those they were projecting the communism, so they could create an anti-communism movement to disguise what the British Round Table and the Fabian Society wanted to actually implement, which was the one world government under a fascist regime. And as a matter of fact, in Europe, there's a lot of documentation that talks about the fascist international movement. And the fascist international movement basically came about as a result of the Fabian Society and the British Round Table and the RIII working with the CFR, that the way they were going to corral us all was what was referred to as the third way. So we're going to create this thing we called communism, and we're going to create this thing that we called, at the time, fascism or Nazism or whatever, so that you have basically made up in people's mind a far left and a far right. And as long as you didn't go that far, either left or right, you could kind of push everybody into the middle, which was called the third way. And there was a guy that actually wrote a book called The Third Way, that was going to be the mechanism for them to corral all of us and move us on to cattle cars towards perpetual imprisonment as debt slaves. And if you look at history, that's basically what has happened. That there is, and that's the reason why I use the term international syndicate. There's a lot of people, especially the leaders in the former Soviet Union, that was on board with the overall concept. They tended more towards centralized planning as well, where the fascist element was more, no, we don't really want to get into the planning. Let the oligarchs do that. We'll just sit in government and control the people. And those conversations actually were had at very high levels. And so I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but it is very interesting that, yeah, I'm going to have to, because I want you to send me the link to what you're looking at so I can kind of go through it and kind of time-wise put together what I know is happening in the covert, because, obviously all of the paramilitary efforts were done for this international syndicate. So it's very easy to be able to tell what they wanted done by looking at what actually got done with the paramilitary force.
Yeah. Everything you say, even though it might not be spot on with the particular thing that I need to look at, is very relevant on a bigger picture. And generically, what you're talking about working together, but also having this overreaching or far-reaching disposition or portrayal as antagonistic enemies rather than allies, is fascinating. And, just to contribute mildly, just as a reference point, science has pervaded quite often military angst and aggression, and scientists have come together for many reasons. And I do love that. I love the fact that there has been an academic understanding, respect, loyalty that has, I think, pervaded in a lot of ways whatever has happened at a military level. And I love the fact it's done that.
Well, I'm jaded now, Moneypenny, and God bless you for thinking that. But I'm now very jaded when it comes to science, because I think the whole effort after World War II and dispersing the scientists of the Nazi era into all of the countries around the world has corrupted what you and I would refer to as science, and that they have gotten bed with the international syndicate and have basically enriched themselves producing what the syndicate wants produced.
Yes, but US funding has actually enabled some very humble people in very humble third world areas to be able to explore their natural abilities and interests in scientific topics that normally would not have the funding, the labs, or the facilities to do it. Now, it's for the wrong reasons. In many cases, US are funding this, things like Kenya or places in Africa that have fantastic facilities funded by the US for the wrong reasons, for bioexploration and biowarfare exploration reasons. But the people that are benefiting sometimes are people who have extraordinary talent who wouldn't normally be able to have it, and then go to conferences across the world with other scientists, and good things can come from it. I'm just saying, I've seen some examples of some wonderful stuff that's happened across borders by people who wouldn't normally get the chance to indulge in that sort of thing.
Right. And I can tell you that back when the whole Ukrainian nightmare was unfolding and the biolabs exposed, that Kenya specifically was one of the places where I don't know why I even went down this road. I mean, I do know why, but one of the things that I found in Ukraine when everybody else was finding the bioweapons is I found what is basically called baby farms. And they have an entire, and I mean, it's like $10 billion a year in selling babies out of Ukraine. And unfortunately, the babies that are not adopted are oftentimes used in scientific projects. And one of the most egregious areas that I found that happening was in some of the more advanced bioweapons labs in Kenya, because they had a corresponding industry there of producing babies. And I inadvertently went down that rabbit hole when I started looking into John of God, who was the, spiritual person for Oprah Winfrey. And if you look in his background, he's now in prison for the rest of his life for actually having a baby farm in Brazil. And so all of that stuff gets very complicated. I think there are people that have done things with good intentions, but there's an awful lot of evil that is going on side by side with it. So, SR-71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. And now that Money Penny has got that song Obsession running through my head. But anyway, in regards to what Money Penny is saying, I'd say there is some collaboration as to what goes on between the Soviet Union, China, and Russia now, forget the Soviet Union, China and the U.S. And the prime example I'll bring to that is the International Space Station.
Yeah.
And I keep going back to that for just one reason and one reason only. Since we brought up this whole Operation Gladio and everything else that's going on, what did Russia have that we didn't during that period?
What?
We're later going to get the Discovery that will get us up there and be able to deliver satellites and do all kinds of stuff. But Russia, at that point in time, had been the only nation on this planet to send something up into space, a rocket and a capsule and everything else, and they landed it on ground. They never put anything in the ocean.
Right.
The U.S. had never done that before.
Right.
So my guess is we were after more than just cooperation. We needed intel.
Right.
and we needed it big time.
Well, and oftentimes the cooperation is the avenue in to collect the intel, which is your point. Yeah, so it may appear to be cooperation, and quite frankly, that's an excellent point, because that's exactly what happened after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Under the appearance of cooperation, we had the Red Cross, which, how could that be bad? Well, the Red Cross mission into Russia post Bolshevik revolution was actually a spying mission by all of the oligarchs in America, going over there to figure out how they could co-opt the new administration that they had basically just funded to do the revolution, to get the railroads built over there, because of course the US wanted the contracts to do it, and to electrify Russia, because of course the Americans wanted the contracts to do it. And so we're taking supposedly a known communist country, and our oligarchs are over there poaching everything. And they're walking out with all the czar's gold. So they're bringing railroads in, and the US and the UK and Sweden was involved in all of this as far as being the exchange mechanism and melting down czar's gold, blah, blah, blah. So there's an entire industry of exploitation, which you can package after the fact as us, just trying to help the people, when in fact, it has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with stealing those people's wealth, just like we stole everybody else's wealth, and allowing the further enrichment of these oligarchs just in a new land.
Just like the opium that you referred to,
Yes.
Which is why the British and the Americans didn't like the fact that other people were making money out of opium. They decided to steam over there and take advantage of it by controlling it all and buying it all, as they did with, well, the Americans did with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, LSD. When they discovered LSD was a big thing that could make people go, woo, and give away a load of secrets, they went and bought the whole world's supply of LSD.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And then used it to experiment on Americans. Ron, go ahead.
So what you're saying is that we basically did like a Perkins with the Soviet Union the whole time. The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. We basically funded them, and they weren't necessarily, forgive me for saying our bitch, but in many respects they kind of were. Is that kind of what you're saying? I
am saying the Bolshevik.
We controlled them, sort of.
I wouldn't use the word control. We exploited them. So we harbored Trotsky here, and the Brits harbored Lenin. So that's where they lived. We took care of them in early 1901. Trotsky is in a very rich apartment in New York City with a refrigerator and a chauffeur, and supposedly doesn't have a job. So where's he getting his money? He's getting his money from 120 Broadway, which is where all of the people that were wealthy lived, and they're basically taking care of him. And him and Lenin both end up walking into Russia at the tail end of the overall, for lack of a better word, civil war, where many of the white Russians were actually nationalists and fighting to actually have a republic. But they were sold down the river after they defeated the Tsar's forces, and the Bolsheviks, with funding from somewhere, with Trotsky and Lenin, were able to overcome the nationalists and defeat them. And that's why they ended up all in the United States and in China and all these other different places. And so the entire operation there, then once the Bolsheviks got set up in government, that again we funded and helped create, we then go in, and the Brits were there too, And we create this opportunity for them to enrich themselves off of the kind of third world backwards, because they had not had a lot of the advantages that had already been taken place in the US in the Northeast area and in the London area. And so we go in and we start exploiting all of that, which is exactly what we did when in the late 80s and early 90s when the Soviet Union fell. We did exactly the same thing.
Right.
The whole
100%.
80s. Yeah, the whole 80s leading up to the fall, the official fall, was positioning of people like Safra and the Hermitage Fund and the Browders and everybody else to run in there and steal all their shit.
Right. And Sutton talks about how there were more Caterpillars and more international trucks built in the Soviet Union than were ever built in the United States.
Yes.
And I just wonder how many of those vehicles are actually still in this country. And that was all American funding and American know-how.
Well,
and technology and all that stuff.
Well, the most egregious thing that I read in his books was the fact that the Germans during World War I and World War II, in that intermediate period, actually built factories for munitions and weapons in Russia, in Soviet Union, because they weren't allowed to have them on German soil. So the IB Farbens and all of those guys are over there building weaponry. And of course, then once Germany turns on, because they had that agreement that they weren't going to go to war. Yeah. So a lot of the weapons,
Molotov-Ribbentrop.
a lot of the factories that end up in the Soviet hands were actual German factories that they used to equip themselves in the interwar period.
Yeah,
that just blew my mind.
And a lot of the German tanks were using Ford engines.
Yes.
I digress.
Yeah, lots of them. So, all right, Money Penny, go ahead.
No, it's just a quick one. So I discovered in the archives that the gyroscopes used in a lot of the Russian missiles from 1999 were made by Lockheed Martin in the United States. Fancy that. Lockheed Martin were making the gyroscopes that became part of the Russian missiles.
So what you're going to find is that the CIA, both with nuclear triggers and the gyroscopes in specifically, the communist, let's see, what was it? It starts with an L. I'll remember it in a minute. There's a company out in California that was big into space technology and satellites and launch vehicles. It'll come to me. That was selling all of their technology to China, like mainland China. And they actually got fined like a $2 million fine, which was nothing because they had already made like $20 billion on the sale of that technology. So again, it's the same concept over and over and over again. The oligarchs will get rich, and there are no national boundaries. There's no national allegiance to any of them. You have Israel that was working with China and giving them our technology. You have Israel working with Iran, giving them our technology, even when they supposedly were supposed to be mortal enemies. And of course, we know that Israel was providing weapons to all of the Latin America people, the bad people that were in bed with the CIA to overthrow, democratically elected leaders down there as part of Operation Condor. So, yeah, it's a big mess, and it's very, very disturbing. But our job here is to educate everybody and make sure everybody knows what the real history that we all share. And obviously, Moneypenny, you're a good example of the fact that, and I was just with Guru down in Australia on his radio show. we all collectively want to do what's right. We don't want to be part of this, and we need to ensure that we collectively hold hands together to get rid of this international syndicate that seems to be uh, controlling us in not a good way. So I'm going to have to run, guys. But I really, really appreciate everybody here. And I just want to tell everybody, please tune in at 9 o'clock. We are going to, as best we can, summarize what we know and what is going on, the commonalities between it, any of the telltale Operation Gladio pieces of what's currently going on. So I hope to see you guys all there at 9 o'clock in the chat. And
is that tonight, Colonel? I missed part of the first part. Is that tonight?
It is on
9 Eastern.
9 on SitRep on Badlands Media.
Copy that. Thank you.
Yeah, CanCon and Alpha Warrior and I will be on the show together. So anyway, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And
One last thing, Colonel.
We love you.
Thanks, Colonel.
Thank you.
Sure.
If I could.
Sure.
That wouldn't happen to be L'Oreal, would it?
That what?
That company wouldn't happen to be L'Oreal, would it?
It's LORAL.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Yes, that's it. Thank you for saying that, SR71. And also just a reminder, mark your calendars if you're new, January 9th at 4 p.m. over on the Corners Corner. It will be streamed into X, but we will not be on a forum like we are right now. It will be one of those one-way X spaces, not the two-way X spaces. But over on Rumble, I will be interviewing Mr. Paul Williams, who authored Operation Gladio, the actual book that got all this started for me. And this is a thrill of a lifetime for me. I am really looking forward to speaking with him and sharing his immense knowledge on this subject with you guys. I'm definitely in the junior league compared to him. So I'm really, really looking forward to having him on our program. So, all right, guys, have a nice night. And I will talk to you guys tomorrow at 4 p.m. Thanks for being here. All right, let's see. We need to close out over here on Rumble. Let me see what I got. No, it was Laurel, Loral. And if you guys don't know their story, I would definitely suggest you look them up. That's a very interesting, and look up the case where they got taken to court for selling state secrets to China. It was a travesty of justice. They should have been convicted of treason. So, excuse me. Let's see. Yeah, God bless her. I didn't see any optimism around that either. Caravaggio. I love your name, by the way. Every time I see your name, Caravaggio, I think of Carabino, which was the neighboring city to San Vito when I lived in Italy. So that's funny. Let's see. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's largest contract chip. Yeah. And just for you guys, I will tell you kind of as the after show secret. I'm convinced that and no, I've not read that SAS book. I have tried to keep my stuff to the CIA side of it, but yeah, I know there's a whole another genre of books that deal with that topic for over in England, but I'm of the firm belief that because Taiwan is like Pakistan, is like Ukraine, a captured nation on behalf of the CIA and this international syndicate, that once they lost the cover, so we signed a treaty to basically a NATO type treaty with Taiwan that we would come to the defense because they were basically our drug supplier. So we couldn't let anything happen to them. And while under Chiang Kai-shek's presidency or dictatorship. So once Nixon recognized mainland China in the early 70s, that voided the mutual defense treaty. It was gone overnight, gone. So that is the exact same time that we make the decision to put all of the chip manufacturing in Taiwan, because these guys all have to have a reason for what they're doing. And so now we are bound by this too big to fail mentality of planting all of our critical wartime semiconductor needs in Taiwan. So it's just another excuse for us to have a bunch of dead American servicemen fighting a battle that we shouldn't be fighting. They make these decisions for that exact reason. The states were set up, the countries, for that reason, to ensure the perpetual strategy of tension. So it makes perfect sense why you would put a critical wartime requirement in Taiwan, because you want a perpetual reason to have that as a piece of strategy of tension with China. So every time you need something to flare up, my throat has got a tickle. All you have to do is saber rattle between those two, and you created another echelon of fear that the whole world's going to tip over. So anyway, I don't think it's any mystery why the majority of the chip industry is in Taiwan. It's just another excuse. Yeah. 96. Yeah, because I knew it was during the Clinton administration, because he's the one, his DOJ let him off the hook. Because who SR-71 was the owner of Laurel? The guy that was the owner of Laurel was an Israeli. And this is Israeli Jewish guy, dual citizen, was selling US secrets to China. But by 1996, Clinton was compromised. That's why Epstein has that picture hanging on the wall in his New York house of Clinton in the blue dress, because they had spies and they had bugged the White House through the mega renovation project with Jeffrey Epstein and the 17 visits into the White House. They had already like booby trapped the entire White House. So they had all the goods on him. They knew he was having an affair and all of that stuff. So that was the background on all of that. They owned Clinton. They, meaning all of the oligarchs, this specific one happened to be Jewish, but that they could at will just sell to whoever they wanted to state secrets, and they weren't going to get prosecuted because they owned the president. That's all about being caught. Yeah, see, and someone said to me how you see their names, William Lorenz and Leo Alpert. So Laurel is Lorenz, L-O-R, and A-L in the Alpert. That's how they come up with the name of Laurel, the name. So, yeah, Adelson flew him back to Israel. Yep, thank you. Got it all back. Yep. All right. So anyway, there's your secret tidbit for my Rumble crew. All right. Love you guys. I will see you later tomorrow, 9 o'clock tonight on SitRep. Have a nice evening.